The silence in the university archive wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a physical weight, heavy with the dust of centuries and the unspoken things hanging between us. I stood by the metal shelving, watching Dr. Amelia Walker trace the spine of a ledger that hadn't been opened since the 19th century. She was a figure of terrifying academic precision, sharp blazer, sharper intellect, eyes that could dissect an argument in seconds. But here, in the dim light, I saw the hidden depths she kept guarded. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light cutting through the shadows, carrying the scent of vanilla, cured leather, and decaying paper. But the air between us didn't smell like history. It was heavy, a physical pressure that had absolutely nothing to do with the curriculum. In that moment, the bustling campus above us, the faculty meetings, the grading, it all ceased to exist. We were 3 floors underground, buried beneath tons of concrete and steel. The lower levels were a fortress of solitude, a sanctuary where cell service died and time seemed to pool in the corners like shadows. It was late, past the hour when the librarians usually flicked the lights to warn stragglers, but we had special dispensation. We were the only 2 left in this subterranean world. I watched Amelia work from my station a few feet away. She didn't just handle the manuscripts, she revered them. Her hands, usually so decisive when she gestured during lectures, moved with a startling, deliberate tenderness now. I watched the pad of her index finger hover over a fragile page, tracing the faded ink without quite touching it, as if she could absorb the knowledge through proximity alone. The climate control system hummed a low, constant bass note, pumping frigid, filtered air into the room to preserve the collection. It should have been freezing. I could feel the chill biting at my exposed wrists, but my blood ran feverishly hot. It was a heat that radiated from the center of my chest, a stark, confusing contrast to the sterile cold of the archive. This late-night research had shifted the ground beneath us. In the lecture hall, she was the professor and I was the promising grad student, separated by a podium and a decade of experience. But down here, surrounded by the raw, messy data of the past, that hierarchy had begun to blur. I wasn't just deferring to her anymore. I was her research partner. I remembered the exact moment the shift happened last week, when she stopped correcting my translations and started asking for my opinion on the syntax. It was a heady, dangerous feeling, this slide from student deference to intellectual equality. The silence amplified everything. The soundscape was microscopic and intimate. The rhythmic swish of a page turning, the hum of the ventilation, the scratch of her fountain pen. But mostly, it was the sound of our synchronized breathing. I found myself matching my inhales to hers, a subconscious attempt to align our rhythms in the quiet. Every small sound felt significant. The rustle of her silk blouse as she shifted in her chair sounded like a whisper right against my ear. I found myself hyper-aware of her presence, tracking her movements with a focus that bordered on obsessive. The way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the way she chewed her lip when she encountered a difficult passage. These were details I had no business noticing, yet I couldn't look away. Then, Amelia's voice broke the silence. "The ledger from 1892, she said. It wasn't her lecture voice. It was lower, textured with a fatigue and a softness that she never showed the department head. It was a voice made of gravel and velvet, vibrating in the quiet space. She didn't look up, but I saw the corner of her mouth tighten. "I need to check the import logs against your translation." The request hung in the air, simple on the surface, but layered with implication. It was an invitation to close the distance. I stood up, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor echoing too loudly, and gathered my notes. As I walked toward her desk, moving from my solitary island to her shared workspace, the air thickened. I was stepping into her orbit, crossing the invisible line that usually kept us safe. The simple act of walking across the room felt like a confession. I placed the ledger down, my hand lingering on the cover, waiting for her to look up, waiting for the collision of our 2 separate worlds. I pulled my chair closer, the metal legs scraping against the linoleum, a harsh, intrusive sound that seemed to violate the hush of the room. We converged over the spread of documents, the 1892 ledger lying open like a dissected chest between us. The ink was faded to a sepia ghost of its former self, the handwriting a cramped, frantic scrawl of a merchant trying desperately to hide his losses from the world. I pointed to the entry for October, my finger hovering just above the brittle paper. The verb here isn't sold, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the sudden dryness in my throat. It's surrendered. Amelia frowned, adjusting her glasses with a sharp, practiced movement. The skepticism radiating off her was palpable, a physical force pushing against my shoulder. Surrendered implies a lack of agency, she countered, her tone clipped with academic rigor. The historical consensus is that this was a strategic liquidation, a business decision. You're reading emotion into a transaction where there isn't any. She turned her head, and for the first time that night, I felt the full, unmitigated weight of her scrutiny. It wasn't the benevolent gaze of a mentor guiding a student. It was the sharp, assessing look of a rival. Prove it, she challenged, her eyes narrowing slightly behind the lenses. Don't just feel it. Show me the syntax. The thrill of it spiked hot in my blood. This was the friction I craved, not the easy agreement of a lecture hall, but the dangerous, exhilarating spark of flint striking steel. I didn't back down. I tapped the page, my finger brushing the paper just inches from hers. Look at the prepositional phrase here, I insisted. He didn't sell to the buyer. He surrendered under duress. The grammar dictates the power dynamic. He wasn't a businessman in that moment. He was a victim. The silence returned, but it was tighter now, coiled like a spring waiting to snap. Amelia leaned in. She moved into my personal space with the terrifying grace of a predator closing in on a realization. The distance between us collapsed. Suddenly, the dry, dusty smell of the archives was gone, obliterated by something warmer, richer. Sandalwood. It was a deep, resinous scent, layered with the vanilla of old paper and something distinctly her, clean skin and expensive, understated soap. It overwhelmed me. I stopped breathing for a second, my focus shattering into 1,000 sensory fragments. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the tiny, precise stitching on her collar, the way her eyelashes cast long, jagged shadows on her cheekbones as she lowered her head. She traced the line I had indicated, her manicured nail clicking softly against the desk. She read it once, twice. I watched her eyes track the text, waiting for the dismissal, the correction, but it didn't come. Her breathing hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible break in her composure. She sat back, the leather of her chair creaking, and the sudden distance felt like a physical loss. "You're right," she murmured, and the admission sounded like a secret shared in the dark. She took off her glasses, folding them with deliberate slowness, and looked at me. Not at my notes, not at the ledger, at me. "I've read this ledger a dozen times," she said, her voice dropping to that low, intimate register again. "I've assigned it to 3 different cohorts of grad students. No one has ever caught that nuance." She rested her chin on her hand, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin prickle. The academic barrier was dissolving, melting away under the heat of her attention. "You see things others miss, don't you?" The words landed heavy, settling deep in my chest. It wasn't just praise for my translation. It felt like she was talking about the invisible currents running between us, the things we weren't saying. The silence stretched between us, sudden and absolute. Her gaze drifted, tracing the line of my jaw, lingering on my mouth for a fraction of a second too long to be professional. It was a look that stripped away the titles, the degrees, the university policy. In that silence, she wasn't Dr. Walker, and I wasn't her research assistant. We were just 2 minds that had found a matching frequency, and 2 bodies realizing they were far too close in a room far too empty. The intellectual friction had ignited something else entirely, a raw, sensory pull that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. I felt the precise texture of her intention. She didn't look away, and God help me, neither did I. The debate was over, but the real trouble was just beginning. "We need to verify the cross-reference," Amelia said, her voice surprisingly steady, given the charged silence we had just inhabited. She stood up, the movement abrupt, breaking the heavy, magnetic pull of the desk. "The companion volume is in the restricted section, row 42. It was a retreat, and we both knew it. She was fleeing the sudden intimacy of the shared desk for the familiar, cold logic of the stacks. But the archive had other plans. I followed her into the deeper gloom of the lower levels, where the automatic lights were temperamental and the shadows stretched long and thin like skeletal fingers. The restricted section was a misnomer. It was a cage. A floor-to-ceiling iron grid separated these rare texts from the general collection, requiring a physical key that Amelia kept on a silver chain around her neck. The sound of the lock clicking open was a gunshot in the quiet. We stepped inside, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. If the main reading room was a sanctuary, this was a tomb. Silent, pressurized, and incredibly, impossibly small. The architects who designed this space in the 50s hadn't accounted for personal space, or perhaps they had and simply didn't care about the comfort of the archivists. The aisles were dangerously narrow, barely wide enough for a single person to walk comfortably, let alone two people trying to navigate the complex, unspoken geometry of attraction. Amelia moved down the aisle, her heels clicking rhythmically on the metal grating of the floor. I followed, keeping a respectful distance that felt increasingly ridiculous. The shelves loomed over us, packed tight with leather-bound volumes that smelled of red rot and vinegar. "Here," she murmured, stopping abruptly in front of a section on maritime law. I stopped too, but momentum carried me a step closer than I intended. The space was so tight that to stand beside her meant invading her personal boundary. I could feel the heat radiating from her back, a tangible warmth that mocked the climate-controlled chill. The air here was stagnant, heavy with the weight of unread words. "It's on the top shelf," she noted, frustration coloring her tone. She reached up. It was a simple, utilitarian movement, the kind of gesture that happens 1,000 times a day in libraries across the world. But here, in the dim amber light of the stacks, it became something else entirely. As she stretched her arm upward, her blazer rode up. The silk of her blouse pulled taut against her torso, outlining the curve of her ribs and the sharp, elegant line of her spine. Her hair shifted, exposing the pale, vulnerable column of her neck and the small, sensitive hollow beneath her ear. I watched, transfixed. It was a glimpse of the woman beneath the academic armor, a flash of physical reality that made my mouth go dry. She strained, her fingertips just grazing the spine of the heavy volume, but she couldn't quite get a purchase on it. "Damn," she whispered, a rare curse that sounded shockingly loud in the stillness. "Let me," I said. My voice was rough, dropping an octave without my permission. I didn't wait for her consent. I stepped in. The architecture of the aisle gave us no choice. To help her, I had to effectively trap her against the shelves. I moved behind her, my body aligning with hers, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the radiant warmth of her body through her clothes. I could hear the sharp intake of her breath, a ragged sound mixed with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of the shelves. I reached over her shoulder. My arm brushed the fabric of her sleeve, a microscopic contact that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. I froze for a split second, my hand hovering near the book, my chest inches from her back. I was surrounding her, encompassing her. In this narrow canyon of forgotten history, the rest of the world fell away. There was only the sound of her breath hitching, the heat of her skin radiating against my front, and the dizzying, exhilarating realization that she wasn't moving away. She was standing perfectly still, allowing this intrusion, allowing this proximity. The air was heavy, charged with words we were too cowardly to speak, and I knew, with a sudden, devastating clarity, that we were no longer just looking for a book. We were looking for an excuse. The volume was a deceptive monstrosity of bound leather and brass clasps, far heavier than its modest spine suggested. As my fingers hooked over the top edge to leverage it from the shelf, the weight shifted unexpectedly. It was a sudden, dense gravity, threatening to topple the volume from its perch. It tipped forward, a dull, heavy slide against the metal shelf. Instinct took over. I braced my forearm against the shelving to catch the weight, but Amelia moved faster. Sensing the slide, the sudden shift in potential energy above her head, she reached up. Her hands didn't go for the shelf. They went for the book. And in the cramped, shadow-strewn geometry of that aisle, there was nowhere for her hands to go but over mine. Her palm collided with the back of my hand. It wasn't a tentative brush or a polite correction. It was a firm, desperate grasp to prevent the book from falling. The contact was electric, a sudden, violent circuit closing between us that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with the months of suppressed glances and carefully worded emails. The shock of it traveled up my arm, seizing my chest. In the freezing air of the climate-controlled vault, her skin was shockingly hot, a feverish contrast to the cold, dead leather of the ledger. It was a tactile overload, the dry dust of the archive clashing with the living, pulsing warmth of her touch. She didn't pull away. That was the detail that changed the world. The book was stabilized. I had it, she had it. The danger of it falling had passed in a fraction of a second. Logic dictated she should retract her hand, step back, apologize for the clumsiness. But she didn't. Her fingers curled, pressing down into the spaces between my knuckles. Her thumb, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps not, swept across the sensitive skin of my wrist, a feather-light graze that felt like a brand. I froze. I stopped breathing. I stopped thinking. I simply existed in the point of contact, acutely aware of the texture of her skin against mine, the smoothness of her palm, the slight roughness of a writer's callus on her middle finger, the fragile delicacy of her wrist bone resting against my forearm. We held the book between us, like a shield, or perhaps a bridge. It remained suspended at shoulder height, a heavy, silent third party in this sudden intimacy. I was still boxed in behind her, my chest inches from her back, my arm reaching over her shoulder, our hands tangled together on the spine of a century-old trade manifest. The silence of the archive, usually so comforting, now felt predatory, waiting for one of us to break. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a thundering drumbeat that I was certain she could hear too. The dust motes seemed to hang suspended in the air, caught in the gravity of the moment. Then I felt it. Her breathing changed. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic respiration of the professor who lectured for 90 minutes without a pause. It was a hitch, a shallow, fractured intake of breath that expanded her ribs against my hovering chest. She was affected. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Dr. Walker, the unshakable, the precise, the woman who corrected thesis statements with a fountain pen and a flat expression, was trembling. It was microscopic, a vibration that only someone standing inside her personal space could detect. But it was there. She was shaking. And she was holding onto my hand not to support the book, but to steady herself. Slowly, with agonizing deliberation, we lowered the book. We moved as one entity, a synchronized machine of muscle and intent. As the book came down to chest level, the excuse for contact evaporated. The crisis was averted. Yet, her hand remained covering mine, her grip tightening slightly before relaxing. She turned her head, just an inch, enough for me to see the curve of her cheekbone in the dim light. The space between us had shifted, becoming thick, heavy, tangible. We weren't just two scholars saving a fragile text. We were two people who had been starving for contact, and having finally tasted it, were desperate not to let go. This wasn't an accident. It was a catalyst. We didn't return to the exposed, open expanse of the main reading room. We couldn't. The main floor, with its harsh fluorescent strip lighting and security cameras, felt too public for the raw, trembling frequency we had just tuned into. Instead, we gravitated toward the reading alcove, tucked behind the structural pillar of the east wing, an architectural blind spot known only to the senior archivists and the students who wanted to disappear. It was a space designed for secrecy, a narrow nook fitted with a velvet bench that had been worn smooth by decades of scholars seeking solitude. We sat side by side, the heavy book spread open across our laps, forcing our thighs to press together in a line of contact that burned through the denim of my jeans and the wool of her trousers. "Read the second clause," Amelia instructed. Her voice had dropped to a murmur, stripping away the projection she used in lecture halls. Here, in the dark, her voice was for an audience of one. I began to read. The text was a dry, 19th century treatise on maritime salvage rights. Animus possidendi, the intention to possess. In any other context, it would have been agonizingly dull. But reading it aloud to her, with the shadows pressing in around us and the smell of her perfume clouding my senses, the legal Latin felt like poetry. To claim the wreckage, I read, my voice sounding thinner than usual. One must demonstrate not only the capacity to recover the vessel, but the will to hold it against the tide. "Stop," she whispered. I froze. I hadn't stumbled over a word. I looked at the page, searching for the error, but before I could find it, I felt her move. She shifted on the bench, turning her body toward mine. She leaned in, invading the small pocket of air I was hoarding. "You're rushing the cadence," she murmured. Her lips were inches from my ear, close enough that I could feel the heat of her words before I heard them. "This isn't a race to the end of the sentence. It's a declaration. Animus possidendi, the intention to possess. You have to say it like you're taking it." She demonstrated, repeating the phrase right at the shell of my ear. Her voice was a low, resonant vibration that traveled straight down my spine. It wasn't a correction. It was a seduction wrapped in pedagogy. The sensation of her breath against the sensitive skin of my neck was a physical caress, ghosting over my pulse point. My heart hammered against my ribs, a traitorous rhythm that I knew she could hear in the silence. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch her eye. She wasn't reading. She was tracking the shiver that I couldn't suppress. Her attention focused entirely on the effect she was having. "Try again," she commanded softly. I swallowed, my throat dry. I repeated the phrase, slowing it down, letting the weight of the words settle in the air between us. "The intention to possess." "Better," she breathed. She didn't pull back. She stayed there, in my personal space, her gaze dropping to my mouth before flickering back up to my eyes. "You're obsessive, you know that? The way you attack these texts, you don't just read them, you devour them." The word obsessive hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Coming from anyone else, it might have been a critique of my work-life balance. From her, in this dark corner, it sounded like a diagnosis of our shared condition. "Is that a problem?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's dangerous," she admitted, her eyes searching mine. "Passion usually is. It blinds you to the risks." I turned fully toward her then, ignoring the book sliding precariously on our laps. The professional distance we had maintained for 2 semesters was gone, obliterated by the shadows and the proximity. "Why did you choose me for this grant, Amelia?" I asked. It was the question I had been too afraid to voice for months. There were 10 other candidates with better transcripts, safer candidates. Why me? She looked at me, really looked at me, her expression stripping away the professor mask to reveal the woman underneath, guarded, hungry, and terrified. "Because," she whispered, "you were the only one who looked at the history like it was still alive." The overhead lights gave a warning strobe, a harsh, fluorescent stutter that cut through the shadows of our alcove. 11:45 p.m. We had 15 minutes before the security locks engaged. That flicker acted like a physical jolt to my system. It wasn't just a signal to pack up, it was a deadline. The sanctuary was dissolving. In 15 minutes, we would have to walk out those doors, ascend 3 flights of concrete stairs, and return to a world where she was Dr. Walker and I was just a name on a grant application. The panic that seized me wasn't about getting locked in. It was about getting locked out of this intimacy we'd finally found. Amelia felt it too. I saw her posture stiffen, the fluid grace of the last hour hardening back into something brittle. She looked at the clock on the wall, then back at me. But this time, the look was different. It wasn't the seductive challenge of the reading lesson or the intellectual sparring of the desk. It was raw, stripped of all the academic armor she wore like a second skin. "We're out of time," she said. But she wasn't talking about the library hours. "We have 10 minutes, I countered, my voice sounding desperate even to my own ears. "We can finish the section." "The section doesn't matter." She closed the heavy book with a finality that echoed in the small space. "You know that. You're smart enough to know that the section never mattered." Her admission hung there, suspended in the cooling air. It was the stark vulnerability of the truth. She was admitting that the grant, the late nights, the obsessive focus on this obscure maritime law, it was all an elaborate architecture constructed to house us. "Tell me," I whispered. I needed to hear her say it, I needed the verbal confirmation before I risked everything. She turned fully on the bench, her knees knocking against mine. Her hands were trembling again, clenched tightly in her lap. I didn't need a research assistant, Avery. I can translate 19th century legalese in my sleep. I needed... She trailed off, her throat working as she swallowed. I needed a reason to keep you in the room. I needed a reason to be near you that didn't violate every ethical code in the handbook. The air left my lungs. The confession was a surrender. A white flag waved in the middle of a battlefield we'd been fighting on for months. You have me, I said. You've had me since the first seminar. I didn't think. I moved. I leaned forward, closing the agonizing gap between us. The hesitation that had ruled our dynamic for months evaporated under the pressure of the ticking clock. I reached out, my hand finding the line of her jaw. Her skin was burning. She leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering shut, her breath hitching in a way that wrecked me. Avery, she breathed, and it sounded like a plea. I tilted my head, aligning my mouth with hers. I could feel the warmth of her breath, taste the anticipation on my tongue. We were millimeters away from the collision that would change everything, from the spark that would burn the handbook to ash. Clack, rumble, clack. The sound tore through the silence like a scream. Somewhere in the main aisle, the rusted metal wheels of a library cart hit the uneven transition strip of the flooring, echoing off the concrete walls with a violent, mechanical clatter. We sprang apart as if physically struck. The spell didn't just break, it shattered violently. Amelia was on her feet instantly, her back to me, smoothing her blazer with frantic, jerky movements. I sat frozen on the bench, my hands still raised in the air where her face had been a second ago, grasping at nothing but cold air and regret. Housekeeping, she said, her voice brittle, pitched too high. She was already gathering her bag, shoving the notes inside without looking at them. The professor was back. The armor was back up, bolted tight. We need to go. Mrs. Gable will be locking the main gate. She walked out of the alcove without waiting for me, her stride fast and efficient, the click of her heels sounding like a countdown. I watched her retreat, the distance between us stretching out again, vast and impassable. The opportunity was gone, chased away by the mundane reality of a janitor's cart. But as I grabbed my coat and scrambled to follow her toward the harsh lights of the exit, I knew one thing for certain. We couldn't unsay what had been said. The truth was out in the open now, bleeding into the sterile air of the archive, impossible to ignore. We emerged from the stairwell into the main lobby, and the transition was violent. The air here wasn't heavy with history. It smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. The lighting was a clinical, buzzing fluorescent glare that exposed everything. The flush on my cheeks, the slight disarray of Amelia's hair, the way we were walking carefully apart, leaving a deliberate space between us. My heart was still racing from the near miss in the alcove, thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I watched Amelia's back as she approached the circulation desk. She had reassembled herself with practiced speed. Her spine was straight, her walk brisk. She looked every inch the tenured professor, untouchable and composed, as if she hadn't just confessed that her entire research project was a pretext to be near me. I saw her hand gripping the strap of her bag. Her knuckles were white. Mrs. Gable was waiting for us. She was a fixture of the university, a woman who had outlasted 3 deans and knew where every skeleton in the department was buried, metaphorically and perhaps literally. She sat behind the high oak desk, peering over her spectacles with a gaze that was deceptively benign. Usually, she just waved us through with a tired smile. Tonight, she was alert. She watched us approach, her eyes flicking from Amelia to me and back again. There was a knowing glint there, a curiosity that made my stomach turn over. Amelia placed the stack of books on the counter. Maritime law of the 1890s, the ledger of the Sea Queen, objects that felt radioactive now. The scanner beeped, a sharp, piercing sound in the empty lobby. Beep, beep. It was bureaucracy trying to impose order on chaos. I stood slightly behind Amelia, holding my breath, wanting to get out the door and into the cool night air where I could think. "Working late again, Dr. Walker?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged space. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at Amelia. "The grant deadline is approaching," Amelia replied smoothly. Her voice was steady, professional. We have a lot of ground to cover. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Gable stamped a due date card with a rhythmic thump. She slid the books across the counter, but didn't let go of them immediately. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the wood, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that carried perfectly in the silence. You know, people are talking. It's nice to see some life in that old basement. She smiled, and then she dropped the bomb. So, are you two the university's new research couple? Everyone's been wondering. The world stopped. The hum of the vending machines, the lights, it all vanished into a ringing silence. I froze. It was the nightmare scenario. A direct question demanding a definition we hadn't even given ourselves. I watched Amelia's profile, bracing for the inevitable deflection, the polite, chilly correction about professional collaboration that would protect her tenure. She stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the stack of books. She didn't look at me. She looked Mrs. Gable right in the eye. The silence stretched, agonizing and thin. I could feel the sweat prickling on my palms. Mrs. Gable's smile faltered slightly, sensing she might have overstepped. But then Amelia took a breath. She didn't pull away. "We are," Amelia said. Her voice was calm. It was precise. It was devoid of shame or hesitation. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a defense. It was a statement of fact. "We are the new couple," she repeated, clarifying the ambiguity, ensuring there was no misunderstanding about which part of the question she was answering. I stared at the side of her face, stunned. My mouth actually fell open slightly. Mrs. Gable blinked, surprised by the candor. Then her smile widened into something genuine. "Well," she said, releasing the books, "it's about time. You two make a lot of sense." "Thank you, Martha," Amelia said. She gathered the books, turned on her heel, and walked toward the automatic doors. She didn't check to see if I was following. She knew I would be. I stumbled after her, my mind reeling, the sound of the sliding doors opening like a portal into a completely new reality. The automatic doors hissed shut behind us, severing the connection to the sterile, climate-controlled world we had just escaped. The night air hit us instantly, a sharp, bracing shock of cold that smelled of wet asphalt, exhaust, and the damp earth of the campus gardens. It was a violent sensory shift, stripping away the dust of the 19th century and dumping us unceremoniously into the present. The hum of the city traffic in the distance replaced the silence of the stacks, but the loudest sound was still the blood rushing in my own ears. The world had shifted on its axis in the span of 30 seconds. The ground beneath my boots felt unsteady, not because of the pavement, but because the rules of gravity I had been living by for the last 6 months had just been suspended. We walked toward the faculty parking lot in a silence that felt completely different from the one in the archive. Downstairs, the silence had been heavy, pressurized, full of things we were terrified to say. Here, under the sulfurous yellow glow of the streetlights, the silence was expectant. It was vibrating. Amelia walked beside me, her stride long and purposeful, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the concrete. But she wasn't walking away from me. She was walking with me. The distance she usually maintained on campus, the professional buffer zone required by the handbook, was gone. Her shoulder brushed mine as we navigated the path, a casual, accidental contact that she didn't correct. I watched her profile in the strobing light of the passing lamps. She looked calm, unnervingly calm, as if she hadn't just blown up her professional reputation with 2 words. I couldn't stand it. The uncertainty was a physical ache in my chest. I stopped walking. "Amelia," I said. My voice sounded thin in the open air, swallowed by the vastness of the night. She stopped instantly. She didn't keep walking. She didn't check her watch. She stopped and turned to face me, standing in the pool of light cast by a lamppost. The shadows cut sharp angles across her face, highlighting the exhaustion around her eyes and the tension in her jaw. "Did you mean it?" I asked, the question tumbling out before I could polish it into something safer. Or was that just damage control, a way to shut her up? Amelia looked at me for a long beat. Then she did something I had never seen her do on campus. She sighed, a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to release the tension of the entire semester. She reached up and pulled the pins from her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. It was a dismantling. The strict, severe Dr. Walker, the woman who terrified freshmen and commanded lecture halls, dissolved right in front of me. In her place stood a woman standing in a parking lot, looking at me with an expression so open it felt dangerous. "I don't do damage control, Avery," she said softly. "And I certainly don't lie to librarians." "But the department," I stammered, my mind racing through the logistics, the fallout, the scandal. "The grant, your tenure review." "To hell with the review," she said. The profanity was shocking, coming from her precise mouth. She took a step toward me, invading my space again. But this time, there was no book to hold between us. "I am tired of living in the footnotes. I am tired of hiding the best part of my day in a basement 3 floors underground because I'm afraid of what people might say." She stepped closer until the toes of her boots touched mine. The heat radiating from her was palpable against the chill of the night. "I told her we were a couple because I wanted it to be true," she admitted, her voice dropping to that low, textured register that made my knees weak. "I wanted to say it out loud. I wanted to hear how it sounded in the real world." "And," I whispered, "how did it sound?" "It sounded like the truth." She reached out then. It wasn't the accidental brush in the stacks or the frantic grasp of the book. It was intentional. Her hand came up, cool from the night air, and cupped my jaw. Her skin was soft, her touch firm and possessive. Her thumb traced the line of my lower lip, a slow, deliberate exploration that made my breath catch in my throat. I leaned into her touch, my eyes fluttering shut, surrendering to the gravity of the moment. "Avery," she murmured. And it was a claim. When she kissed me, it wasn't tentative. It wasn't the shy, fumbling first kiss of a new romance. It was a collision. It was slow, deep, and deliberate. A precise, unflinching read of my intentions. She tasted of mint tea and relief. It was the taste of months of suppressed desire finally being allowed to breathe. I felt her other hand slide around my waist, pulling me flush against her, anchoring me in the chaos. The cold night air vanished. The parking lot vanished. There was only the heat of her mouth, the strength of her arms, and the overwhelming, undeniable realization that we weren't researching history anymore. We were making it. We retreated to the safety of her Volvo. The heavy door thudded shut, sealing us inside a private capsule of leather and silence. The engine remained off, but the heat radiating from our bodies began to fog the windows, blurring the sharp angles of the campus into soft, indistinct shapes. It felt like the world had narrowed down to the space between the bucket seats. Amelia gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the dark material. Not to drive, but to ground herself in the aftermath of the explosion she had just detonated. She turned to me, the amber street lamp casting long, dramatic shadows across her features, highlighting the curve of her throat and the sudden, raw openness in her eyes. "You realize," she said, her voice steady but pitched low, vibrating in the small space, "that tomorrow changes the architecture of everything. The department head, the tenure committee, the whispers in the faculty lounge. It won't be quiet anymore." I watched her, studying the woman I had spent months analyzing from a distance. "I don't want quiet," I admitted, the truth sitting heavy and sweet on my tongue. "I've had quiet. It's lonely. I want this." She smiled then, a genuine, unguarded expression that cracked the stern facade I was so used to. It made her look 10 years younger, lighter. "God, you're brave. Braver than I was at your age. Braver than I've been for a decade. You just told Martha Gable, the biggest gossip in the tri-state area, that we're a couple," I countered, leaning back against the headrest, watching the way her eyes tracked my movement. "I think you win on bravery tonight." She laughed, a rich, throaty sound that filled the car. "That wasn't bravery, Avery. That was necessity. Survival instinct. I couldn't walk out of there one more time pretending you were just a colleague. It felt like lying to myself." We spent the next hour mapping out the terrain of this new world. It was a mutual discovery, a negotiation of a relationship that had gone from theoretical to undeniably real in the span of an hour. We sat in the dim light, knees angled toward each other, dissecting the future. We agreed on the boundaries. The work would remain impeccable. The research would be unassailable. We wouldn't give them a single reason to doubt the scholarship or the data. But the rest? The weekends, the late nights, the spaces between the translations, those were ours now. The archive, she mused, her finger tracing the stitching on the steering wheel, a nervous, tactile habit I was just learning. I always thought it was my escape, a place where the noise of the university couldn't reach me. I hollowed out a space down there just to breathe. She looked at me, her gaze dark and warm, stripping me bare. I didn't realize I was waiting for someone to break in. I didn't break in, I whispered, reaching across the center console. You left the door open. Maybe I did. She took my hand. Her fingers interlaced with mine, a perfect locking fit that felt inevitable. And I have no intention of closing it again. The conversation drifted from logistics to us. She told me about the first time she noticed me in her lecture, not as a student, but as a mind that challenged hers, the way I'd argued about the trade routes in the second week. I told her about the terror of that first office hour, how I'd practiced my questions in the mirror so I wouldn't stutter. We were rewriting our own history, recontextualizing months of professional distance as the prelude to this intimacy. It was getting late. The campus security patrol car rolled slowly past, its amber lights sweeping over the fogged glass, illuminating us for a brief second. Neither of us flinched. We were safe here. You should go, she said finally, though her grip on my hand tightened, betraying her words. We have a grant proposal to finish tomorrow, and I need to draft an email to the dean before the rumor mill beats me to it. And a reputation to uphold, I added, smiling. To ruin, she corrected, grinning back with a wicked glint in her eyes. We have a reputation to ruin, and frankly, I can't wait. She leaned in for one last kiss. It wasn't the desperate collision of the parking lot. It was soft, lingering, a promise stamped against my mouth. It tasted of the future, of shared coffees and difficult translations and waking up together. Good night, Avery, she whispered against my lips. Good night, Amelia. Getting out of the car felt like stepping out of an airlock, but the cold didn't bite as hard this time. I walked to my own car, my body humming with a frequency that hadn't been there this morning. I felt grounded. I felt seen. For the first time in my academic career, I wasn't just chasing history. I was living it. I pulled onto the main road, checking the rearview mirror. The library loomed in the distance, no longer a tomb of dead words, but a sanctuary. We study history to understand the past, but tonight I realized we write it with every choice we make. If you've ever found love in the quietest places, subscribe for more. Tell me in the comments, what risk are you ready to take?